invested in popular music, and although I'm finding myself less invested in visual forms of culture, and I've made the argument in the book and elsewhere that the nature of our relationship to those forms of popular culture is itself changing, right? And maybe I'm a symptom of, without knowing it, of what I'm describing. But the way I work when I'm trying to do cultural studies is I collect thousands of instances. So I get files, at newspaper clippings. For the last book, it was newspaper clippings, magazine articles, just everything that seems to connect into this. And then I organize them into files, and then I reorganize them and subdivide them and reorganize them, right? So it's a kind of what Deleuze might call assemblage process, or Latour, assembling the social. And the difference, yes, I suppose in the earlier book, what I was assembling was more popular culture, because the question I was asking was more about what's the relationship between the popular and the new conservatism. Because, what started out to be a book that was about youth culture, which was going to be called Another Boring Day in Paradise, turned into a book about the contradictory relationship between the new right and popular culture. Right, in which, and for me, it was most noticed for me in terms of their relation to popular music, so they could both simultaneously attack it and appropriate it. And I wanted to know what was going on and how this might help us understand the success of the new right. So it was inevitable that I would use those more affectively charged forms of popular culture. In the latest book, meaning Caught in the Crossfire, I started with a very different set of questions, because it isn't, there is absolutely nothing in that book about youth culture, right? If I were to stay with the project, the second half of the book might be now to go back and look at youth culture in the 21st century and to see how that is articulated to and against and resists and supports and enlists and seduces what I've analyzed in Caught in the Crossfire. But that wasn't my question. My question was, how do we understand what's happening to kids from the position of dominant society? So there, I was interested in the way the news talks about it, and it's too hard to do television news. It's too hard to get, and there's too much of it, so it's easier to say I can take 2 or 3 major newspapers and use them. I was interested in, what the medical apparatus is doing, what the legal apparatus. So it was a much more informational struggle that I had to wage to gather bits and pieces of evidence and then assemble them into arguments, and then assemble them into bigger arguments about the economy and about political culture. And so it was just defined by the question I was asking about the context, which in part I think is defined by the changing context. We got to get out of this place is somehow still an optimistic book. Most people don't think so, but I think it's still an optimistic book. By the time I started to write or started to imagine Caught in the Crossfire, I was finding it, and still do, increasingly difficult to find the spaces for hope and optimism in American political culture. Right? And so I was trying to figure out something else. Right? The context seemed to already be changing, and it partly arises because, the reason I picked kids to write about was twofold. One was because I thought I owed it to them. In a sense, it's one of the arguments I had with lots of my friends who write about popular music is I built a career of studying kids. And a very comfortable career, right? And yet, if you look at the world, kids are getting fucked incredibly. They're getting fucked a lot worse in the third world than they are in the first world, but they're getting fucked in the first world. All of them. Black kids worse than white kids, but the white kids are getting fucked too. And we, who have made our career off studying these kids, it seems to me, have some responsibility to stand up and say, what are you doing? In the name of children, look what you're doing to the children. Right? And I also have the naive hope, the other side of it was the naive hope that maybe if you could make visible to American society what they were doing to children, they might actually take it seriously. That children still is one of the last sites of privilege in our society. Like the current debates in the U.S. about whether you can execute someone for raping a child, right? And because that is still, children are, it's still in flux, right? There's still a large part of that discourse that children are innocent, privileged, to be protected, even while we're throwing them in jail and giving them extraordinary, psychotropic drugs. So I was hoping to get into that space of contradiction and say, well, if you care so much about children, you ought to see what you're doing to them. It didn't work. Cultural studies obviously has tried in the past to deal with questions of how the economy is articulated into and by the social totalities. It's done it badly. The good news is, so has everyone else on the left. I'm sorry, I don't, as I said, I don't believe empire. I don't believe all these arguments about the information economy or the cultural economy or any of these things. I don't think we've done a very good job. And I think we need to back up and say, we need to reinvent how to do economics, right? One of the two major disciplines we haven't done very much work with are political science and, most importantly, economics. So I have a chapter in my new book, and it's called Rescuing Economies from the Economists, right? But part of that means I have to engage with economics. I have to engage with economists because they do know something, right? I mean, what they're saying is true in some sense. So I have to engage with economists, but I also have to recognize that we tend to assume that all economists are neoclassical economists. There are a lot of other economists out there. So we have to engage with the diversity of economists. There's a wonderful group, very interesting kind of internet group called the Post-Autistic Economics Group. Autistic because they say, economy has cut itself off from reality. And their descriptions of their project sound a lot to me like my description. What they want to do is bring economics to the rest of the world, and I want to bring the rest of the world to economics. So, I'm trying to set a conversation with these people. We also need to realize that, the economy is constructed. And it's constructed not just by the discourses of economics, but by all the myriad discourses. There are so many discursive constructions of economics and economies. We don't get to say, oh, this is the way neoclassical economists construct the economy.